thanks for all of you who pre-registered. If you didn't pre-register, we're glad you're here anyway. This is the second in our series. The title of our series is Living in the WUI. And how many of you can tell me what a WUI is now? Okay, a wildland urban interface. Okay, one of the objectives of this series is to make sure that everyone in this area learns wildland urban interface and more about living in a wildland urban interface. So this is the second in that series. If you missed the first session, which was What's Bugging Our Trees, it is available online at the ENMU Ruidoso website under Community Ed, and then there's a link for Forest Health Speaker Series. And they will also be recording this session and putting it up as well. And how many of you were at the last session, the first session? Okay, a lot of repeat visitors. We appreciate that. This is a collaborative effort between quite a few different organizations that some people don't, think work together, but behind the scenes, these folks do work together quite often. And that includes DIA Mescalero Forestry, ENMU Ruidoso Community Ed, who's done a lot of the, most of the work with the registration and the setup and the website and all of that, which we appreciate very much. That's mostly Elisa Maui and Coda Omnis, and Lisa's the person you'll see behind the video camera later, so please thank her for all of her efforts. Lincoln County will also be involved in some of these sessions we do later, and the Lincoln National Forest, of course, U.S. Forest Service, and Smoky Bear Ranger District. I'm with the Little Bear Forest Reform Coalition, as is Mary Ann and a couple of the folks outside registering folks. South Central Mountain RC&D Council, Mike Caggiano is here from there, and he's on our committee as well. And of course, Village of Ruidoso Forestry with Dick Cook, their forester, and also Village of Ruidoso Fire Department, Harlan Vincent. And there's also a new organization I want to make all of you aware of. There's an auxiliary being formed for the Village of Ruidoso Fire Department. And they're still working on their nonprofit status, but the folks serving the chili, John Hall and Lynn and I forgot the other name, Myers, Mr. Myers, Mike Myers, they're forming that auxiliary, and later on in the year, they will be raising funds for use for the Village of Ruidoso Fire Department, to buy equipment and things that maybe isn't able to be funded through the village. So we all want to support that cause as well. We have a lot of folks who have donated to serve food and create door prizes, and so I'd like to thank Prino's Country Club, Family Dollar, Josie's Framery, Lawrence Brothers Supermarket, Pizza Hut, Ruidoso Mortgage, Smoky Bear Ranger District, Spencer Theater, and the Treehouse Cafe, and Village of Ruidoso Fire Department. We'll have door prize drawings towards the end, and we've got some really great door prizes, so don't run out and things get a little slow. We've got 2 tickets from Spencer Theater to the Redneck Tenors performance that's coming up. We've got some great videos donated by some private individuals and by Smoky Bear Ranger District, some bandanas and other goodies from Smoky Bear. So it's going to be a really interesting and informative evening. Our next session you want to put on your calendar is December 3rd, and that evening we're going to have a historical look. It's close to Christmas, and a lot of people think of Christmas trees and that kind of thing. And so we're going to have Mickey Mauder from the Lincoln National Forest do a presentation on the historical look at timber harvesting on the National Forest, and looking at how things used to look and how they look now, and why things happen the way they do. It's going to be very interesting. And the Smoky Bear Ranger District is going to be selling Christmas tree tags. So you'll be able to get your Christmas tree tag at that event as well. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our main speaker for tonight. This is Mr. Frank Silva, and he's the timber manager with the New Mexico State Forestry in the Capitan District. And Mr. Silva has lived in Lincoln County a long time, I won't say how long, but, and has been in this field in one way or another for many, many years, and has a lot of expertise. And we'll have the presentation, questions and answers, and then we'll have a panel to follow. So enjoy.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Let me just start by thanking Mary and the Little Bear Forest Reform Coalition and ENMU for kind of putting this together. It's kind of one of the things that we at State Forestry do is education, getting the word out there of what needs to happen. And we're basically a support group for private landowners. So fits really well with what we have to do. So our topic, what a healthy forest looks like, you would think that maybe that would be an easy thing to do. We'll just come up with a definition, we'll give a few examples, and we're done, right? It's not quite so easy. If you make the analogy to the human body, you can say that in the human body, you've got different systems that operate at a level of equilibrium called homeostasis, but it's at a stable level. If it strays away from that, you're sick. If as long as you maintain that norm, you're healthy. Well, that doesn't translate to a healthy forest, because a healthy forest, for one thing, is more dynamic. It's a moving target. It's constantly changing. It's got pressures on it, stresses on it, and it's constantly having to adjust. So that's one issue. The other issue is that the forest itself is just one portion of the larger system called the ecosystem. And so the ecosystem is composed of many different parts, and each of those parts is interrelated to the other parts. It's interdependent on the other parts, and you can't isolate one of them and talk about just forest health or just the different components. So it makes it a little bit more difficult when you're talking about that. One of the things that we like to do is, instead of looking at it as a healthy forest, we look at it, a better term is sustainability. Sustainability has some implied parts to it, and one of them is sustainability implies resiliency. A healthy forest is resilient. It's able to cope with the stresses, able to cope with the pressures that are put on it. It'll bounce back. It'll recuperate, whatever term you want to use, but it has that ability to be resilient. The other aspect of it is that it has to have a certain level of functionality. And the third thing is it has to be productive. And you can define productive in a lot of different ways, because when you look at forest health, there's a lot of different perspectives. It depends on how you're looking at it, from what perspective you're looking at it. You could be looking at it as a wildlife biology that would look at it totally different from a fire ecologist. And so you have to tie all those pieces in together. So we'll start with some real basic concepts. They're basic, but they're key. They're important. You're familiar with the process, or at least somewhat of a knowledge of photosynthesis. This is a very simplified version, but it's important to know that plants need light, they need water, they need carbon dioxide that they absorb through the leaves, and they take all of that material in through a pretty complicated chemical process. It takes that using chlorophyll, which is the green stuff in the plants, and converts it into whatever that plant needs in order to grow. If you disrupt any one of those, it's going to change that process. So even though it looks like a simple process, it's real vital in how that plant functions. The stomata we'll talk about a little bit later. They'll have a key role in when we start talking about the drought and things like that. Okay, like I said, we were talking about the forest being an ecosystem. It's just one component of the overall picture. Again, this is a simplified version, but just to give you a visual of what we're talking about. Every part is dependent on the other part. You can't talk about the wildlife without talking about the decomposers, without talking about the water cycle, without talking about the carbon cycle, without talking about any one part of it. They're all tied together. And that's what makes a single definition of forest health real difficult. And all of the parts have to function correctly. A lot of the things that we see in the forest are, we see ebbs and tides or growths and declines, and all of that is natural and normal, whereas if you use the analogy of the body, those ebbs and tides, we would be sick. In a forest, that's not always necessarily the case. It's just a part of the natural process of what happens. But the key thing that as we go through all of this stuff that I want you to kind of keep in mind is that the forest is dynamic. It's ever changing. It's not static. You can't take a picture of the forest and say, that's what it looks like, that's what it's going to look like 100 years from now, that's what it looked like 100 years before. It's not that way. It's constantly changing, and we'll get into some of those aspects of it. So the forest has connections, like we said, to the animals, to the plants, to the soil, to the air, to the water. All of those things tie together. And you can't talk about the forest without talking about the watershed. And the forests are real key in the health of the watershed. The watershed can be, for a definition, can be anything as small as one single little stream. It can be as large as a whole one canyon, or as large as maybe the Rio Grande Valley system that runs the whole length of the state, or even further. So it depends on what confines you, and that's the same case with the ecosystem. The ecosystem can be small or it can be large. It just depends on how you want to define it. But as far as forests go, the trees have a big effect on the forest, on the watershed. If you have too many trees on that watershed, it causes a lot of things. Too many trees, because of the sunlight that we talked about, is going to be inhibited coming through the canopy. The undergrowth is going to be less. If it's less, you have more soil. The water that comes down is not going to be absorbed, but it's going to run off. If it runs off, you don't have as much infiltrating into the groundwater, which is real vital to us. If it runs off, you're going to have flooding. So there's a lot of issues that can arise from the forest. And I know everybody here has heard of the concerns because of the fire, then you have the floods. And that's the reason. Without the ground cover, that water just runs off. And so the forests are important in holding not only the water, but eventually the soil, which also gets lost. And that disrupts the whole system as well. Okay. Forests go through a natural change, like we talked about. They're ever changing. One of the changes that we talked about is called succession. And just simply put, we'll get into it a little bit more, but simply put, if you had a field that was plowed and planted at one time, but then no longer is planted, and you look at it later, what happens? First thing that comes up, of course, is the weeds. And then if it stays there long enough, the grasses, then maybe the shrubs, then maybe the seedlings. And I've seen forests fields that have actually grown up into forests, and you would never know that they were fields. But it's the natural progression of what they go through. A good example of that is down Gavilan Canyon, right where that 90-degree turn is, where that church is there. That fire was in, I think, 1967. something like that. So that fire has occurred at that time, and you can see what it looks like now. Of course, and it's typical, the north slope is going to look different from the south slope, and they actually have different vegetation. The north slope has more pine trees, and the south slope has more juniper. And but that's a part of the process of succession. So what causes succession? Typically, succession is caused by, we call them disturbance agents, or anything that disrupts the forest. Usually, it doesn't have to be a fire that's dramatic that wipes it out. It can be something small, and it can be on a small scale, or it can be on a large scale. We'll talk more about fire here in a little bit. This, of course, you might recognize as Little Bear. That's Sahonsky Run, and that's Angus. But that's going to cause a succession. It's nature's way of kind of resetting itself for whatever reason. It's like, okay, let's start over. Take it all out, and we're starting over. Insects is another one. And again, I know the last session was on insects, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. I just want to mention a few things. Insects is one of the disturbing agents that we see. And this is the same as is on that chart up there, and I know it's a little difficult to see. Basically, the brown are the areas that were mapped in 2009 and 2011, and I didn't have access to the latest one, the 2013. I've seen it, and the brown is double what that one is. So you can see the progression through the several years there. One thing to note about the insects is the insects have always been with us. The fire has always been with us. And there are certain times in history when they get to epidemic levels. It's just like the flu. There's some years where the flu is real bad. It's real devastating, covers a large area. And there's other years where it may just cover a small area and may not be quite as bad. And it's the same kind of thing. But when it gets to an epidemic level, then you have the kind of outbreak that you see here. Other disturbing agents can be the effects that humans have had through the past. Can be anything from grazing to logging, road building, development. Any of man's endeavors usually ends up being a factor, and it could be a minor factor or it could be a major factor. It just depends. Okay, one of the things that we use is try to go back to what we call historic conditions, or there's other terms for it. And we do that for several reasons. If you try to compare or look back at what the forest should look like, which is what we're trying to get at, one way to do that is by looking back in time and assuming that before human intervention that was the natural state or what it should look like. There's a problem with that, though, and it's not a problem, but it's just something that you have to be aware of. When you do that, all you're doing is taking basically a snapshot in time and saying this is what it looked like at this spot at that time, and you're not taking into account what caused it to be where it is, because there were hundreds of years before that where it was going through the changes that we're talking about, the succession and the beetles and the fire and all that. All of that made it what it was then. So you got to be careful in just saying that's the way it should look like, just like it did back in 1856. You know, that may or may not be true. I mean, it takes more than just that comparison. But one way that we do this is old surveys. I have one back here in that notebook that was done in 1883. And what's interesting about it is the field notes that he wrote at the bottom. And I happen to know where that is. It's where I live. It's on my place, so I know what it looks like today. But back then, when that was done, his field notes are pretty interesting. A lot of it is scattered pinon cedar, a few scattered trees here and there. You know, and the description of what he was writing is not what we see today. So it's pretty interesting. Tree rings is another one, and I have we call them cookies. You cut a slice of a log, and you look at the tree rings, and you can read history from the tree rings. Basically, I mean, just simply put, there's a paper there that explains it, but there's basically when the rings are wide, it indicates a wet year. When they're narrow, it indicates some kind of disturbance. It might be drought, it might be beetles, it might be whatever. And there's kind of an art to reading it, but simply put, that's it. So you could take a tree ring and look back at what the conditions were like then. The problem with that is that's what the conditions were like where that tree grew. That's not telling you what the condition was like somewhere else. So if you're really doing a study on what the conditions were like, you have to take a representative sample and make sure that you get the right data and not base it on one tree that you cut. So you got to be careful with that. Early explorers writing, if you really want to delve into it that deep, a lot of them were very descriptive, kind of like the surveyors, but even more so. And the problem with that is they weren't scientists, and they weren't trying to describe it in scientific terms. They were just telling you what they saw. And one account that I was reading said that back in the 1800s, when they were looking at what the conditions were like then, and they compared them to some of the explorers in the 15 and 1600s, the description was pretty close. So that tells us that that time period was, there was not a whole lot of change. I'm sure there was. We know there was because forests, that's what they naturally do, is they change. But it's just kind of an interesting comparison. And the last one is photographs. And we're going to go through some just to show you firsthand. Again, you have to be careful because photographs will tell you what it was like at that point, at that time, and not what the other conditions were. And it could, there's some art license that might be taken, you know, when you're on a vacation, you take pictures of what you like, right? And so the photographers might have been taking, well, that looks like a good picture, and you take a picture, but they weren't taking it for the purpose of recording what the vegetation was like. But you can still find really good examples of some that were taken. This is one which I have a bigger one, and I know it's pretty hard to see for you, but you can come up afterwards. This is a classic Forest Service poster that depicts the same site taken usually 10 to 20 years apart, starting in 1909, the first one, and going all the way to 1989. And you can see the progression. The first one was after it had been harvested, so we don't know what it looked like before. But it gives us a starting point. So in 1909, and taken periodically, you can see the progression of the growth and what happens. That's another example of succession. And this makes the case up at the top is that this area had not been burned since 1895. So that's real key. I know this is difficult to see. This is coming up Indian Divide on Highway 380 before you top out to the top. The first one, taken about 1900, I'm not sure of the exact date. There's a gentleman that used to work for NRCS, Hollis Fox, that published a whole book with photographs like that. This is one of them. And the main thing from all of these photos that I'm going to show you is to look at the vegetation. Look at the change in the vegetation. Up on that one, there's almost no vegetation, except on a few of the slopes and a few of the canyons. And here you can see how much it's grown in 90 years. This shows the highway that goes through the bottom. The switchbacks there was where the railroad used to go up Indian Divide from Carrizosa to get the coal from Captain. Okay, these are interesting, but again, we're looking at them for the purpose of looking at the vegetation. Okay, the Ruidoso Mill, and these are actually taken from two different perspectives at two different times, but you can still get the idea. This is taken basically from the valley, looking just like you would see it driving down the road. But look at the background, at the vegetation in the back. This was taken later, somewhat later, probably in the 40s. Quite a big change. Lincoln, that's before the highway was put in because that's a dirt road in front. But look at the vegetation in the back. That typical pinon, juniper, woodland, pretty sparse. It's not too thick today either, but because it's on the rocky hill and the site conditions are different. But anyway, and I have a better photograph of that one on Ruidoso. This is Ruidoso. Looking at it from, my best guess is probably somewhere where the Pizza Hut is, maybe back the mill would be on this side, and you're looking up the canyon. That would be Carrizo Canyon going that way. But again, look at the vegetation. Some of you may or may not be familiar with some of these places, but Parsons Mine of Bonito Canyon, well, it's not Bonito Canyon, but Tambar. Mesa Ranger Station, it's no longer there, but that sits up on the mesa up at Loma Grande. This is the Ruidoso. You probably recognize that mountain. Sierra Blanca's in the background. Again, looking at the vegetation. If you're familiar with that, what that looks like today, you can't even see the mountain. It's covered. And this is a photograph, part of it's Bonito City, but it's about the location of where the dam is, approximately. I don't know exactly, but it's approximately where the dam is located. And you can see the vegetation. Okay, so getting back to our succession, this is what it would look like in photographs. And you can look at a forest at different stages in this, so it's hard to say this is where it started and this is where we're going to progress. We might have started at the bottom and gone up, who knows. But let's start with a mature forest. In a mature forest that doesn't have disturbing agents, nothing is affecting it, nothing is taking out that undergrowth, will look like that, and eventually will look like that. Now, in our definition, we talked about sustainability and resiliency. Which one of those three would be more resilient? You know, obviously, the top one would be more resilient. Resilient to what?
Fire.
Okay, fire, insects, disease. You know, it's obvious that if you get something started in a mess like that, it's probably going to burn, or the bugs are going to kill it, or the fungi are going to get it, or something is going to wipe it out. The other think about this photograph, going back to our slide about the watershed, if you look at the ground, you know, you see a lot of bare dirt in a situation like this because the sunlight does not penetrate. There's so much competition